Hello, I'm Sarah Ferman from Israel. The topic of my talk is comparing narratives of Hebrew-speaking children from Israel and English-speaking children from New Zealand, challenges and outcomes. So, we compared between personal narratives from Hebrew-speaking children from Israel and English-speaking New Zealand children. The Israeli participants included 20 children, aged 10 boys and 10 girls, all were with typical development, native Hebrew speakers from middle to high SES, according to a demographic questionnaire that was developed for this study. They were compared to 20 matched New Zealand children who told the same narratives under the same conditions. Each participant was asked to tell 6 personal narratives. Here we analyzed only the problem narrative. We analyzed the narratives at the microstructure level and at the macrostructure level. At the macrostructure level, we measured the length of narrative by counting the number of utterances and total number of words, the grammatical complexity by calculating the MLU in words, and the semantic diversity by counting number of different words. At the macrostructure level, we measured the setting, the problem, the initiating event, the internal response, the plan, the action, the consequence, and conclusion and or closure. The rating was 0, 1, 2, or 3, according to the instructions that were developed for this study. So the research questions were, are the differences between Israel and New Zealand narratives regarding microstructure measures and macrostructure level? Comparing narratives from different languages raises language and reliability challenges that are, however, intertwined. The first challenge was to decide in what language should the data analysis be performed, in the original language, Russian, Greek, Portuguese, or Hebrew, or a translation of the narratives from all languages into English. If the data analysis is done in the original language, this should be done, of course, by native speakers, and then reliability between native speakers is required. If the data analysis is done on the translated narratives, there are 2 options. The first option is to analyze the translated narratives only by native English speakers. In this case, reliability between English speakers is required. The second option is to analyze the data, the narratives in both the original language by native speakers and the translated narratives by English speakers. In this case, reliability between native speakers, between English speakers, and between native speakers and English speakers is required. We piloted the last option. To this aim, the Israeli research team translated 4 Hebrew narratives into English. It was tricky to translate the narratives, not so easy. The Israeli team analyzed the Hebrew narratives, and reliability between Hebrew speakers was high. Then the New Zealand team analyzed and translated narratives. They reported that it was very difficult to understand the translated narratives, and it was very difficult to code them. And indeed, reliability between English speakers was low. Moreover, reliability between native speakers and English speakers was very low. So we concluded, our conclusion was that it is difficult and tricky to translate narratives properly, and it is difficult to code translated narratives. Therefore, our decision was to analyze the narratives in the original language. So the first question was, are there differences between Israeli and New Zealand narratives regarding the microstructure measures? Here we can see the total number of utterances that were produced by the Israeli children and the New Zealand children. We can see that Israeli children used more utterances than the New Zealand children. However, the difference between the groups was not significant. Here we see the total number of words, a comparison between Israel and New Zealand. Again, Israeli children produced more words than the New Zealand children. But again, the difference between the groups was not significant. Here we see the number of different words. Israeli children produced more different words than the New Zealand children. The difference between the groups was not significant, but it was borderline 0.72. MLU, mean length of utterance. Again, the Israeli children used longer utterances than the New Zealand children, but the difference between the groups was not significant. To summarize, the Israeli children seem to be at an advantage regarding the syntactic complexity, the semantic diversity, and the verbal productivity. However, the differences between the groups were not significant. The results support the notion that Israeli and New Zealand children are relatively similar at the microstructure level of personal narratives. What could explain these results? There are some factors that could have influenced the results, including language typology, Hebrew versus English, culture, Israeli versus New Zealand. The results suggest that neither the language typology nor the Israeli versus New Zealand culture had a significant effect on the measures included at the microstructure level of the personal narratives. It is possible that the main factor influences microstructure level, at least in young children, is age. The development of syntactic complexity, semantic diversity, and verbal productivity. So, the second question was, are there differences between Israel and New Zealand narratives regarding the story grammar measures? Here we see the total story grammar rating, Israel versus New Zealand. We can see that Israeli children demonstrated higher story grammar rating than the New Zealand children. This difference was not significant, but it was borderline, 0.78. Here we see the score of each of the story grammar codes separately. We can see that the Israeli narratives were superior to the New Zealand narratives in 6 out of the 8 story grammar codes, including initiating event, internal response, plan, action, consequence, and closure. However, maneuver showed a significant main effect for internal response and closure. So, more developed internal response and closures appeared in the Israeli stories, Israeli narratives. So what can explain these results? Language typology, Hebrew versus English. It is possible that the typology of Hebrew, more than the typology of English, leads to a strict adherence to the structure and quality of the narrative. Culture, Israeli versus New Zealand. Also, both Israeli and New Zealand children live in a Western culture. It is possible that there are nevertheless differences between the Israeli and the New Zealand culture. It is possible that the Israeli culture and environment encourages children to externalize feelings and thoughts and not leaving problems open and unresolved. Sorry. In addition, half of the Israeli children were from the Jewish religious sector. In religious families, on the Sabbath evening, which is Friday evening, and on holidays, family meals are held, during which children are expected to talk about religious issues, but also about personal events. These repeated experiences can accelerate the development of the ability to tell stories, narratives, and especially personal ones. In addition, it is important to note that two different teams analyze the Israeli and the New Zealand stories. The possibility that this had an effect on the results cannot be ruled out. One of the aims of the present study was to examine the sensitivity of the protocol. The results may indicate that the macrostructure codes, at least the macrostructure codes, are sensitive to subtle differences that may exist between groups of children, such as young children from two Western nations. Nevertheless, further research is required to verify the findings by comparing narratives in different languages and by children from different cultures. It may be interesting to examine the effect of age on the achievements and the sensitivity of the protocol in impaired populations such as DLD, ASD, and low SES. I would like to thank my MA student, Hannah Sverdlov, who collected the data and analyzed it. And of course, thank you for your attention.